Alrighty, cool. So let's go ahead and work through this. We'll swap out those implementations, run the tests, and take a look at this. So we're not passing the right props to the switch component because toggler props doesn't exist. So let's add toggler props to our state and helpers. So toggle is a helper. This toggler props is also a helper. So what do we normally need to pass to buttons and this switch, which is going to pass that onto a button under the hood? But what do buttons normally need to take? Well, they'll need an on click, and also here in my notes I add we also want an aria expanded. And so we'll just add that. Aria expanded is this.state.on, and on click will be this.toggle. And that actually is all we need to do. So this is a prop collection for anybody who's using this component. If they want to render a toggler, whatever that means for them, these are probably the props that they need to apply. Now they could do these themselves just fine, but it's a common enough case that we're going to provide a prop collection for them. So does anybody have questions about this pattern? Kind of used in combination with the render props. I don't think that there's any other, like I suppose there could be use cases with other patterns, but generally this, yeah, makes the most sense as part of the render prop pattern.
Is there any downside, or should any other pattern be used if it's like a ton of common props?
You mean like if this toggle or props is a big object? Yes, actually, and that's prop getters, and we'll talk about that in a sec. Even with this many props, prop getters is actually a step up from this. Good question.